Hello and welcome to the Soc 3 Module 4 Part 1 lecture on becoming a critical reader. So for the last couple of weeks we've been talking about what it entails to be a critical thinker, and we're going to talk about in this brief video lecture how we can incorporate these critical thinking skills into how we read a text. So I want to first briefly discuss various qualities of a critical reader. So I'm going to focus on 4. So a critical reader, first of all, is someone who questions the perspectives, assumptions, and evidence behind an author's argument, specifically in a text. Just because something is published in published form, even by reputable journals or reputable newspapers, does not necessarily mean that it's correct. So a critical thinker needs to approach any text that she or he reads with a questioning attitude, as we talked about when we talked about what is critical thinking. A critical reader is also someone who does not passively accept the authority of the printed word, no matter what kind of venue that reading is published in, whether it's a newspaper article or a book, certainly if it's an advertisement. Think about the last time that you saw an advertisement. Actually, research finds that we are bombarded with literally thousands of advertisements per day, especially if we watch television, listen to the radio, drive by a bus, etc. So we are just bombarded with this information. So we don't always just want to accept that what someone is telling us when it's in print is actually correct. Third, as a critical reader, we need to keep in mind that we need to train our minds to ask certain questions and look for particular clues, especially so that we can separate essential points from less important ones. This one's very important for a reason I think you guys are going to like. Think how much reading you have to do in a particular semester, right? You've got quite a bit of reading for this one Soc 3 Critical Thinking About Society course, and I know most of you have many other courses that also carry a heavy reading load. So add that to the fact that many of you are working and have to read various texts in your professional life, and then have to read various things in your personal life. So we're going to go through a critical reading exercise here in a moment that really teaches you how to ask a particular set of pretty simple questions that once you train your mind to ask these questions anytime you're going through a text, it's going to actually allow you to get through those texts more quickly and really be able to pick out the main idea, which is, whether it's for school or work-related reasons, is the thing we usually have to do when we're reading a text. And then finally, a critical reader is someone who can break apart an author's argument to see how all the different pieces fit together. So there are 5 key questions that one should ask themselves when they're trying to read a text in a critical way. The first one is just, what is the question that's being asked and answered in this reading? Is the author trying to solve some kind of puzzle? If you could really just put it into one question in the form of a question, what is the author or authors asking? 2, how does the author answer the question that you just formulated? Oftentimes, I like to do this in my own reading because I think it's being very nice to the reader. Oftentimes an author will actually say, the question that I seek to answer in this article or book is, they'll actually put it in the form of a question. So be sure and look for that. Not all authors do, but many of them often do this, and it's a really nice way to signpost what the main idea of the text is. And then in terms of the answer, a lot of times authors will say, I will argue in this reading that. And anytime you see an author preface a sentence or a paragraph with, I will argue that, or my argument in this article or book is, then it's a pretty sure bet that that falls into that answer category. Third, we want to ask, what assumptions does the author's main argument rest? Are they assuming anything? Number 4, what evidence does the author use to support her or his argument? Right? As we talked about before, evidence is absolutely key when it comes to being a critical thinker. We always want to ask, where's the evidence, right? Why are you making that argument? So we definitely want to do that when we're doing this critical reading exercise. And finally, persuasiveness. Is the argument persuasive based on the evidence the author provides? So what I want to do is I want to walk you through this critical reading exercise as it relates to the reading by Furstenberg et al., Growing Up is Harder to Do. So a couple of things. One, et al., that looks a little strange, doesn't it? Et al. Is simply an abbreviation for a Latin expression, meaning that there are other authors. So here, Furstenberg, Frank Furstenberg, is the first author, but there are additional authors. And it just keeps you, it's a way of not having to repeat the other authors' names over and over. So if you were wondering what that meant, that's what it means. Secondly, I want to explain why I gave you this reading. I think this is a fascinating reading. I think it's a reading probably a lot of you will be able to relate to. I certainly did when I first read it when I was in graduate school. And it's a lot about what it means to be an adult today. And it's a really good reading to start thinking about a key critical sociological concept, which is a sociological imagination. So I'll get to that in just a moment. But what we're going to do is we're going to ask those 5 questions in relation to this reading. What are Furstenberg et al. Asking in this reading? How do they answer that question? What are their assumptions? What evidence do they use? And then based on this evidence, is this argument persuasive? So in terms of critically thinking about society, one of the first things that we want to do is we want to learn how to develop what C. Wright Mills, a very famous sociologist that was writing a lot in the mid-20th century, what he called a sociological imagination. And I absolutely love this idea because it's core to what the field of sociology studies, how it studies it, and how sociologists are trained to think. So one of the things I want to do in this semester is not only develop your critical thinking skills, but especially develop your critical thinking skills in terms of this concept of the sociological imagination. And that gentleman's picture in that lower right-hand corner, the glasses, he's looking all kind of inquisitive. I think he's almost thinking in that picture. That is C. Wright Mills, the gentleman who coined this theory. So he argues when writing about this theory that social, economic, and political factors really shape the individual choices that we can make. They profoundly shape our social experience. And we have to think critically about how various social factors, such as our economic class, our race, our gender, I didn't put this on the slide, but our sexuality, how much education we have, where we grow up, these are all social factors. How these social factors either enable us to engage in certain personal behaviors or, as often as the case may be, restrict us or limit us in some ways. So the sociological imagination is a concept that really says we have to understand our personal experience, but also social trends at the intersection of 3 important things. 1, individual experience. How does it shape individual people's ways of being in the world, the way they think, how they go about living their daily lives? We also have to think about it at the intersection of social structure. And by social structure, we mean all of those different social factors: class, race, gender, education, sexuality, immigration status, your family status, like whether or not you're married or if you're a parent. And then finally, historical context. We have to think about how things change over time, and especially how personal experience is largely shaped not only by social context, but by the time period in which you live. For example, being a college student in 2015, or in the early 21st century, is a lot different than being a college student even 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So the Furstenberg et al. Reading, and we're going to apply our critical reading exercise to that reading, is really a nice way of introducing us to what it means to think with a sociological imagination. Because essentially what Furstenberg and his co-authors are asking is, how are social understandings of adulthood changing, right? So that's their key question. And their answer is that a new stage in the life course, what they call early adulthood, has really emerged as people tend to delay major life transitions that we typically associate with adulthood. So education, financial independence, full-time employment, and marriage and parenting, right? These are what sociologists would call the typical or traditional markers of adulthood. But as Furstenberg and his co-authors argue, it's becoming a lot harder to reach these markers. And if you think about it, I could ask all of you, well, why do you think it's harder? And I think you guys would be able to come up with the answer. Education. School is getting more expensive. Fewer public resources. less public funding is going to education, even at state universities like Cal State Fresno. So for a lot of people, what that means is going into greater debt and also having to stay in school longer, especially as more people have to work. Right? It's becoming harder to establish any kind of financial independence and employment. We know that the job market now is not as good as it has been in other time periods. And in terms of marriage and parenting, a lot of people want to be financially independent before they want to get married or before they have kids. So we see those things pushed off more and more. So in terms of the assumptions that their argument rests on, they're really defining adulthood, not necessarily in terms of those traditional markers, but in other ways, right? And they find that based on their research and the evidence they provide, that financial independence is really becoming more key. Now, look how I put the word adulthood in quotes here, right? So when we typically talk about adulthood, from a social perspective, right, we're not just talking about becoming the age of 18 or even 21. Now, that's the legal way to define adulthood. But as sociologists, one of the things we do is we really focus on how things like being an adult or even being a child, right, is largely dependent on social norms. Right? What are the social ideas and values and markers that we use to define these life course stages? So hopefully you can start to see that sociological imagination come into play here, how different social trends, like the fact that education is getting more expensive, is profoundly shaping individual experience in this particular time period, this particular historical context. Chances are most of you, right, are actually having to work or, make great sacrifices. Maybe it's taking more classes per semester or taking out more student loans because college is more expensive. So the next question we want to ask is, what evidence do the authors use to support this argument? Well, just one piece of evidence, and this is not the only piece, is on page 37 of the reading, where they use census data. That's a government agency, the U.S. Census Bureau, census data to show how both men and women are delaying these traditional transitions to adulthood. And it's not just because people are lazy, right? The next time you hear someone say, oh, young people these days are so lazy, you can look at them and say your sociology professor said, in fact, no. The reason that we see a lot of young people delaying these transitions and perhaps even going back to live with mom and dad is because the social, political, and economic conditions in which they're becoming adults are changing significantly and making it harder to reach full adult status. So you tell them that and you just see what they say. And then finally, notice on the issue of persuasiveness, I leave that open as a question because that is largely a matter of personal opinion, right? How good you think the evidence is, but this is something you always want to end on. I, for one, found their argument very persuasive. They provide some very reliable and reputable evidence suggesting that what they're saying is actually true. So in terms of being a critical reader, if you could actually walk yourself through a similar exercise, and trust me, you're going to be able to do this much more quickly as you get more practice, you're going to very easily be able to pick out the main components of a reading. You're going to be able to apply your critical thinking skills, and you're probably going to start to read text more quickly. So developing these critical reading abilities will really help you in all areas of your life. Thank you.